You know Michigan for its Great Lakes, its auto industry, and its endless forests. But there's a darker side hiding beneath the pines and buried under the dunes. Scattered across the Upper Peninsula, lost in the woods of the north, and swallowed by the very land itself, are towns that once roared with industry and ambition. Now they sit silent, erased from maps, forgotten by everyone except the people who know where to look. In this video, we're uncovering 13 ghost towns in Michigan you're not supposed to know about. And make sure you stick around until the end, because the #1 ghost town on this list didn't just die. It was buried alive, swallowed by the earth itself. And what happened to the people who lived there is still a mystery. So hit that subscribe button and let's begin. Number 13, Sheldrake, Chippewa County. On the remote shores of Lake Superior, where the wind howls off the water and the winters last 6 months, the ruins of Sheldrake slowly rot back into the forest. Getting here requires a long drive down unmarked logging roads, and most people who make the trip have no idea what they're looking at when they arrive. Sheldrake was founded in the 1880s during Michigan's Great Lumber Boom. The forests of the Upper Peninsula seemed endless, and companies rushed to harvest white pine before their competitors could. A sawmill was built on the lakeshore, and a company town grew around it. At its peak, Sheldrake had several hundred residents, a school, a company store, and boarding houses for the lumberjacks who worked the surrounding woods. Lake Superior served as a highway. Ships arrived to haul lumber to cities across the Great Lakes. For 2 decades, Sheldrake thrived on timber. But the forests weren't endless after all. By the early 1900s, the best timber had been cut. The sawmill closed. The ships stopped coming. Families packed what they could carry and moved on to the next boomtown. Sheldrake was abandoned to the elements. Today, only foundations and scattered debris remain. The lakeshore has reclaimed much of the old town site. Rusted machinery lies hidden in the underbrush. The few remaining structures have collapsed under decades of snow and neglect. It's one of the most isolated ghost towns in the lower 48, visited only by hunters, hikers, and historians willing to make the journey. Number 12, Central, Keweenaw County. Deep in the Keweenaw Peninsula, surrounded by forests that have grown back over a century of scars, lies Central. This was once the headquarters of one of the most profitable copper mining operations in American history. Now, it's a collection of ruins slowly being swallowed by the woods. The Central Mining Company established operations here in 1854, just as Michigan's copper boom was taking off. Unlike rough mining camps, Central was built to last. The company constructed substantial homes, a company store, a school, churches, and even a library. At its peak in the 1870s, over 1,000 people lived here. Copper poured out of the ground. But the copper ran deeper and harder to reach as years passed. By the 1890s, operations were struggling. The mines closed permanently in 1898. What makes Central remarkable is how much was left behind. Several buildings still stand, including the old mining company office and rows of workers' homes. The cemetery holds graves dating back to the 1850s, many with inscriptions in Finnish and Cornish. Unlike most ghost towns, Central is partially maintained by a historical society, but it still feels abandoned, especially in winter when snow buries everything and silence becomes absolute. Number 11, Pequaming, Baraga County. On the shores of Keweenaw Bay, a lumber baron once built his private empire. He constructed a model town for his workers, complete with the finest amenities money could buy. For 40 years, Pequaming was a shining example of what a company town could be. And then it was abandoned almost overnight, and the baron's heirs burned most of it to the ground. Pequaming was founded in 1878 by Charles Hebard, a lumber magnate who wanted to create the perfect company town. He built elegant homes, a general store, a hotel, recreational facilities, and even a working farm to supply fresh food. The town had electricity before many cities did. It had running water and indoor plumbing when those were still luxuries. Hebard treated his workers well by the standards of the era, and Pequaming became famous throughout Michigan. But the lumber eventually ran out, as it always did. When the Hebard family sold the company in the 1940s, the new owners had no use for the town. In a decision that still outrages local historians, they burned many of the original buildings rather than maintain them. What remains of Pequaming today is scattered along the bay shore. A few original structures survived the fires, including some worker homes that are still occupied. The old company store building stands empty. Stone foundations and overgrown lots mark where the rest of the town once stood. It's a ghost town with an unusual twist, destroyed not by abandonment, but by deliberate destruction. Number 10. Bell, Keweenaw County. Another victim of Michigan's copper bust, Bell sits high in the Keweenaw Peninsula, accessible only by rough roads that become impassable in winter. For a few decades in the late 1800s, this was a thriving mining community. Now, it's one of the most complete ghost towns in the Upper Peninsula. The Bell mine opened in the 1870s during the peak of Keweenaw copper fever. A small town grew around the mine shaft, housing workers and their families. Bell had a school, a boarding house, and the usual collection of buildings that mining towns required. The work was dangerous and the winters brutal, but the copper kept people coming. By the 1890s, the ore was playing out. The Bell mine shut down in 1895. Unlike larger mining towns that hung on for decades, Bell emptied almost immediately. There were no other jobs, no reason to stay. The buildings were left standing and the residents simply walked away. Today, Bell is remarkably preserved by Michigan standards. Several log structures still stand, their walls weathered silver gray by over a century of exposure. The old mine shaft is still visible, though sealed for safety. Mining equipment rusts in the clearings between buildings. The isolation that killed the town has also protected it from vandalism and decay. Number 9. Fayette, Delta County. Rising from limestone bluffs overlooking Big Bay de Noc, the perfectly preserved buildings of Fayette look like a movie set. This is Michigan's most famous ghost town, so intact that visitors can walk through the same streets workers walked over a century ago. Fayette was established in 1867 by the Jackson Iron Company as an iron smelting town. Limestone cliffs provided flux for the furnaces. Hardwood forests provided charcoal for fuel. The harbor allowed ships to bring iron ore from mines across the Upper Peninsula. At its peak, Fayette had 500 residents and produced over 200,000 tons of pig iron. The company built a self-contained community with homes, a hotel, an opera house, and all the facilities a town required. But technology changed. When coke replaced charcoal as smelting fuel, Fayette's reason for existence vanished. The furnaces went cold in 1891. Within years, Fayette was empty. The state acquired it in the 1950s and transformed it into a historic park. Buildings have been stabilized and restored. It's beautiful and accessible, but some ghost town enthusiasts find it too polished. The wildness that makes abandoned places compelling has been tamed. Still, for anyone wanting to see what a 19th century industrial town looked like, Fayette remains unmatched. And hey, I hope you're enjoying this journey through Michigan's forgotten places. If you are, take a second to hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Now let's head back into the wilderness for our next ghost town. Number 8. Mandan, Schoolcraft County. Lost in the forests of the central Upper Peninsula, Mandan requires serious effort to find. There are no signs pointing the way. The roads are rough and unmarked, but those who make the journey discover one of the most atmospheric ghost towns in Michigan. Mandan was founded in the 1880s as a company town for the Manistique Lumber Company. Like so many Upper Peninsula towns, it existed to harvest timber and nothing else. Workers lived in company housing. They bought supplies at the company store. Their children attended the company school. The entire town belonged to the lumber operation. At its peak, several hundred people lived in Mandan. Trains hauled logs out to sawmills on Lake Michigan. The forest echoed with the sound of axes and crosscut saws, but the timber that seemed inexhaustible was gone within 20 years. When the trees ran out, the company closed operations and dismantled what they could sell. Mandan was abandoned by 1910. Today, Mandan exists in a state of advanced decay. Building foundations are visible but overgrown. Railroad grades cut through the forest, the tracks long since removed. Scattered artifacts lie where they were dropped over a century ago. The isolation means Mandan sees few visitors, which has preserved its melancholy atmosphere. Walking through the site feels like intruding on a place the forest is slowly digesting. Number 7. Dawson, Montmorency County. In the northeastern Lower Peninsula, far from the major tourist routes, a small collection of ruins marks the site of Dawson. This lumber town lasted longer than most, surviving into the early 20th century. But its end came just the same, and what remains tells a familiar Michigan story. Dawson was established in the 1880s to supply lumber to the rapidly growing cities of the Midwest. A railroad connected the town to markets in the south. A sawmill processed logs floated down nearby rivers. The usual supporting businesses grew up around the operation. Hotels, saloons, general stores, all catering to lumberjacks with money to spend. For 30 years, Dawson thrived, but the cutover came eventually. By the 1920s, the forests around Dawson had been stripped bare. The sawmill closed. The railroad stopped running. Without lumber, there was no economy. Families drifted away to find work elsewhere. By the 1930s, Dawson was effectively abandoned. What remains of Dawson today is minimal. Foundation stones mark where buildings stood. The old railroad grade has become a trail. A handful of structures survived but have since collapsed. The site is on state land and accessible to visitors. Dawson is typical of dozens of Michigan lumber towns that rose and fell within a single generation. Number 6. Clifton, Keweenaw County. Clinging to the steep hillsides of the Keweenaw Peninsula, Clifton was one of the earliest copper mining towns in Michigan. Its story spans the entire arc of the copper boom, from wild optimism to slow decline to eventual abandonment. Today, it offers one of the most accessible glimpses into Upper Peninsula mining history. The Cliff Mine opened in 1845, just after copper was discovered on the Keweenaw. It quickly became one of the most profitable mines in the country. A town grew around it, perched on terrain so steep that some buildings required stilts to stay level. At its peak, Clifton had over 1,000 residents. Churches, schools, and businesses served the mining families. Fortunes were being made, and everyone wanted a piece. But the Cliff Mine hit its limits by the 1870s. The richest copper had been extracted. Deeper mining became less profitable. The company struggled through the 1880s and finally closed in 1887. Clifton's decline was slower than some mining towns, but just as inevitable. Today, Clifton is one of the better preserved copper mining ghost towns in Michigan. Several buildings still stand, including the old mine office and workers' homes. The ruins of the mining operation are scattered across the hillside. A county historical society maintains some of the site, offering tours during summer months. The views from Clifton across Lake Superior are stunning, a reminder of why people were willing to work so hard in such a remote place. Number 5. Garden Island, Charlevoix County. 15 miles offshore in northern Lake Michigan, accessible only by boat, an entire island sits virtually abandoned. Garden Island was once home to a thriving fishing community. Now, only a handful of seasonal residents remain, and the old town slowly returns to nature. The island was settled in the mid-1800s by fishermen who worked the rich waters of northern Lake Michigan. A small village grew on the island's southern shore, complete with homes, docks, and fish processing facilities. Families lived here year-round, enduring isolation and brutal winters in exchange for abundant fishing grounds. At its peak, over 100 people called Garden Island home. But commercial fishing declined through the 20th century. Fish populations crashed due to overharvesting and invasive species. Regulations tightened. One by one, the fishing families left for easier lives on the mainland. By the 1990s, Garden Island was nearly empty. Today, the island is part of a state wilderness area. The old village site contains abandoned homes, collapsed docks, and overgrown clearings where gardens once grew. A few cabins are still used seasonally, but no one lives on Garden Island year-round anymore. Reaching it requires a boat and knowledge of Lake Michigan's unpredictable weather. Those who make the journey find one of the most isolated ghost towns east of the Mississippi. Number 4. Nonsuch, Ontonagon County. Deep in the Porcupine Mountains, at the end of a road that seems to lead nowhere, lie the remains of Nonsuch. This copper mining town existed for less than 20 years, but what remains is one of the most atmospheric sites in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. The Nonsuch mine opened in 1867, part of the second wave of copper mining that swept the western UP. A small town was constructed to house workers, built in the wilderness miles from any other settlement. The mine produced decent copper for a few years, enough to justify continued investment. but the ore deposits were shallow and inconsistent. By 1880, operations were winding down. The last miners left by 1885, and the forest began its slow reclamation. What makes Nonsuch special is its setting. The town sits within the Porcupine Mountains Wilderness State Park, surrounded by old-growth forest that is regrown over the cut-over lands. Hiking trails pass through the town site, where foundations and mine openings are still visible. The isolation feels complete. Cell phones don't work. The nearest paved road is miles away. Standing among the ruins of Nonsuch, you understand just how remote these mining operations really were. Number 3. Pear Cheney, Crawford County. In a forest clearing in northern Michigan, a rusted fence surrounds an old cemetery. The graves are weathered and worn. Some have been vandalized over the years, and according to local legend, this place is cursed. Pear Cheney is one of Michigan's most notorious ghost towns, wrapped in stories of witchcraft and plague. Pear Cheney was founded in the 1870s as a lumber town along the Michigan Central Railroad. For 2 decades, it was a typical small community. Then, according to legend, everything went wrong. The stories vary, but most versions claim that epidemics struck the town in the 1890s. Diphtheria, scarlet fever, or some unknown disease killed residents at an alarming rate. Some blame a witch who cursed the town after being ostracized. By 1917, Pear Cheney was completely abandoned. Historians know the truth is more mundane. Pear Cheney did experience disease outbreaks, but so did many frontier towns. The lumber ran out, which was the real reason the town died. But the legend has made Pear Cheney famous, and visitors have damaged the site through vandalism and occult rituals. Today, the cemetery is all that remains. A few headstones stand among the trees. Some visitors report feeling watched. Others claim strange lights or voices. Whether you believe the stories or not, walking through Pear Cheney at dusk will raise the hair on your neck. Number 2, Red Ridge, Houghton County. On the shores of Lake Superior, the ruins of an engineering marvel stand slowly collapsing into the water. This is Red Ridge, home to 2 massive steel dams that once supplied water to a copper mining operation. The dams still exist, but the town that built them is gone, and both structures are now considered too dangerous to approach. Red Ridge was established in the 1890s to support the Atlantic Mining Company's operations in the Keweenaw. The company needed water for processing ore, and they needed a lot of it. Engineers constructed 2 enormous steel dams on Salmon Trout River, creating a reservoir that fed water to the stamp mills. The dams were technological achievements, among the earliest steel dams built in America. A small town grew around the operation, housing workers and their families. But the Atlantic mine closed in 1911, and without the mining operation, there was no need for the dams or the town that served them. Red Ridge emptied quickly. The dams were abandoned but never removed. For over a century, they've stood in the forest, slowly deteriorating. Today, the Red Ridge Steel Dam is considered one of the most endangered historic structures in Michigan. The steel has corroded, the foundations have shifted. Signs warn visitors not to approach, though many ignore them. The dam could fail at any time, which would send a wall of water toward Lake Superior. It's a ghost town with a ticking clock, a piece of industrial history that grows more dangerous with each passing year. If you've made it this far, drop a comment and let us know which of these ghost towns you'd want to explore. And stay with us, because our number 1 entry wasn't just abandoned. It was swallowed whole, buried under mountains of sand, and no one knows exactly what happened to the people who refused to leave. Number 1, Singapore, Allegan County. On the eastern shore of Lake Michigan, somewhere beneath 60 feet of sand dunes, lies an entire town that was buried alive. Singapore was once one of the most important lumber ports in Michigan. Today, it doesn't exist on any map because it no longer exists in any visible form. The sand took everything. Singapore was founded in 1836 on the banks of the Kalamazoo River, just upstream from Lake Michigan. The location was perfect for lumber operations. Logs could be floated down the river from forests stretching deep into the interior. Ships could load lumber directly from the port and haul it to Chicago, Milwaukee, and other growing cities around the Great Lakes. At its peak in the 1870s, Singapore had over 2,000 residents. It had 3 sawmills, 2 hotels, a bank, several general stores, and all the infrastructure of a proper town. Singapore was larger and more prosperous than its neighbor to the north, a tiny settlement called Saugatuck. For a few decades, Singapore looked like the future, but the very industry that built Singapore also killed it. Lumberjacks stripped the forests bare for miles in every direction. Without trees to anchor the soil, the sand began to move. Lake Michigan's constant winds pushed the dunes inland, at first slowly, then faster. Streets that were clear one year were buried the next. Buildings that stood solid were overwhelmed by advancing walls of sand. The residents of Singapore tried to fight back. They shoveled constantly. They built barriers. But you cannot stop a dune. And there you have it. 13 ghost towns you weren't supposed to know about, hidden across Michigan's forests, shores, and wilderness. From cursed cemeteries to buried cities, from copper boom to lumber bust, these forgotten places remind us that nothing in Michigan is permanent. The same forces that built these towns destroyed them, and the land always takes back what was carved from it. If you enjoyed this journey, make sure to subscribe and let us know in the comments which ghost town surprised you most. We'll see you in the next video.